Hello, everybody, and we're back for chapter 57 of Language of Creation, and our journey continues into the depths and the heights um, of Genesis, I guess. Um, and I've been reading, and I came to chapter 60, where it's all about dreaming, and yeah, I feel like my last couple weeks kind of have been in like a dreamlike state. Um, not having feet on the ground. Like I'm also really getting a sense of like the levels or the layers in which these things simultaneously can happen, right? So you can have actual tiredness, but you can also have an ungroundedness. You can have all of these layers. Um, And obviously they interact, and we'll get to that how the lower and the higher the fractal layers uh, communicate. So I guess I'm gonna try and pay attention on how to wake up or how not to be caught in the sleep, because um yeah you well there's two ways to wake up when I just look at it. One is to be well rested, and the other one is that something calls your attention. Um, and they both have their functionality, and they're going to probably map on something in a future chapter. Um, but yeah, that's what I'm going to get into. And for all the people interested, Gustav was here at my place this week, although he's not there to brag about it. So I can only confirm that I kicked him out of the house, and that's all I'll say. He can tell you the rest. um, yeah, Daniel, you want to go next?
This is the first week that I haven't actually finished the reading, so my intention is to catch up at the last second. I don't really have much to say. Um, Mark, you want to
go? Yeah, sure. Because I read ahead last week, I didn't even reread this week. Of course, I've read this before, so too much rereading is bad too. But I mean, we were discussing this before we went live a little bit. The tone maybe of the book has changed a little bit, and we're into the section where effectively what we're talking about are these fractal patterns and introducing new concepts in and then showing how they're fractal, right? In what way does this concept affect, say, one layer up or one layer down or whatever, right? So you get a sense for the for the actual pattern of of what's going on. And so my intention is to pay sort of closer attention to how that pattern manifests and hopefully share my findings with y'all as usual. So Castle, you want to go next?
I was muted. There we go. My subject here is left-handed mediation, as you can tell by the fact that I had myself muted, and I'm full tilt participating in that against my own will. So I'm just labeling something that's already happening. I also, interestingly, in my preparation for this weekend's festivities here, I read everything from Moby Dick, but I didn't touch this book at all. And so I have read this before, but it's been a very, very long time. And so I am a little bit lost, but I think that that's okay as far as my participation goes, because it's going to be very left-handed. I'm going to be a little bit more exploratory with this. We'll do it live. And I'm perfectly fine with that. So I see it as a win, and I will hand this off to my more balanced friend here, Christopher, and he can explain what a more complete view looks like.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I said balanced mediation here. This whole section of chapters relating things to mediation between left, right, up, down, forward and backward, and so that's what I'm kind of how I'm attending to these sections. The section of the book at the human scale, as he said. So, Olivia, Lena.
Yeah, I'm looking to get to hear what people think about the concept of intoxication at the personal level and then how that scales to all the other layers as well.
Okay, it's interesting that we kind of got the sense that we're kind of detached from the content. Like one of the experiences I had is like I know I read this book before, but I don't remember reading this. It's like why didn't I register in this? So yeah, I think there was some sin happening there. Um, so I guess do we want to pick up something from last week? Is that something that we? Well, I guess not.
Well, just I mean, it's worth stating that last week was cosmic scale, communal scale, individual scale, right? And so that's that macrocosm, microcosm, right? And so showing those relationships, and like I said, that sort of continues here, but he's adding concepts and then showing the relationships in these chapters.
I'd like to mention, actually, I think we didn't really go over this page all that much. I just want to kind of point out the line that he has up there where he talks about subgroups being analogous to Adam's left hand on a greater scale, and then he lists off these different manifestations of clowns, musicians, actors, spies, turncoats, and so forth. Just kind of being able to see that aspect, because we're going to get into the aspect of as Elena was looking forward to the intoxication, but then also that's going to be shown at the communal scale. And there is the sort of aspect of intoxication that winds up happening when you have musicians and actors and spies and clowns and that sort of stuff. And so like that manifests in a different way. So I just want to point out that he's laid a little bit of groundwork in that previous page for the folks at home.
Okay. Then yeah, so here's the idea of the relationship between the internal and the external pattern, right? And there's this idea of incorrectly supporting the spirit with facts and informing matter with meaning, right? So he's trying to have the relationship. What was it again? With the flash and the refinement, right? Like he's now putting that in on a more abstract layer, right? Where he's putting it with facts and spirit and matter and meaning. And so these things can deviate to certain degrees, right? And then that will cause problems. And he's going to use a Genesis tree as basically the introduction of that problem at the cosmic scale, which was interesting because we actually went over this yesterday. Kind of independent from this. Does anybody want to add anything to this page?
I would maybe just add an aspect of, we've kind of discussed a little bit the difference between like good and evil, or like, like goodness and evil, and then like good and bad, and that aspect. And just to kind of make a note with the aspect of sin here, that Yes, it's like there's also, and he kind of details that, okay, there's the external like sin in the world, and then there's the interior microcosmic sin inside. But there's also the sort of aspect where it's like, you know, if you're just clumsy and like you tripped over something, like that is perhaps incorrect mediation, but in the same way that we're kind of differentiating goodness and evil and good and bad, that there's not necessarily like, you know, if the folks at home get scrupulous or something like that, like you didn't sin if you tripped over a rock or something like that. But there is kind of like there's a larger scale aspect of the of like proper mediation. So like a graceful person wouldn't trip over a rock or something like that. Like if they were moving gracefully, they had good circumspection and stuff like that. That's a presence of something. But or like an additional perfection, maybe you could say, but that would be different from an aspect of failing to mediate correctly and then like, you know, choosing to mediate incorrectly rather than just like being a muppet, you know.
Well, and I want to introduce sort of two other concepts because these are flat pictures. You know, sin is the incorrect union of heaven and earth, right? So we're standing in between the two and mediating them, right? And that's where we belong in this outline. And obviously you can see that in the external mediation, right? Adam in the macrocosm, which again, that was from the previous chapter, right? We've been talking about microcosm, macrocosm. But it's important to think of a union requires an alignment, right? And the other concept I want to add, because these are flat pictures, because alignment isn't the thing, right? The thing is orientation plus alignment plus a will, you know, an action creates a union. So you need that alignment and you need that orientation to get that alignment, right? And so that and just to reiterate here, the purpose of this is to show you the same picture at different scales, so you get the pattern, right? You're extracting out the symbolic patterns. You're not supposed to say, oh, this is the same as this. It's not the same. That's why it's a macrocosm as opposed to a microcosm. In the same way that alignment is not the same as union and orientation is not the same as alignment, right? But there's a pattern there that you get a sense for at scale, right? And that's actually super important. So I just want to make sure that doesn't get missed.
And I think I also want to just kind of add this aspect of, especially to the point that these are, you know, flat images, that sometimes when mediation is required, like the proper mediation isn't actually there until like the work is done. So there is sort of an aspect of, if someone is mediating and the final result hasn't actually happened yet, like that's not necessarily sin either. Like the refinement process of, you know, like having to make a sword and like, you know, heat it up, whack it with a hammer a whole bunch of times, wet it, and just do that over and over again. Like that's also not at any point, if you were to like take a break or something like that, like that's not sin. It's just an ongoing process of refinement.
Well, but yeah, I would also argue that you could just break that up into fractal patterns, right?
Yeah.
So you could do one cycle of like heating the sword in a sinful way or in an unsinful way. But
yeah, so you would break through the paradox by kind of having that higher frame.
So yeah, this was like a wall of text for me. Yeah, pretty intense. So the first thing that stood out to me is in the middle of the first thing is one type of sin is the result of Adam's failure to mediate with heaven and the other failure to mediate with the earth. So I'm not sure what he literally is pointing to, but the thing that I feel like is missing in the story of Adam and Eve is that he's also mediating between Eve and God, right? So that's like a different sort of role, right? And you could like say that Eve is Earth in that scenario. but I think that's where Adamson is mainly occurring. I don't know if anybody wants to go into
Well,
that.
there's a lie of omission, right? There's all kinds of little, right? I mean, in the way you notice the mediation is broken is that he's hiding, right? Because he knows the shame of his nakedness. So it's yeah. I mean, once you go, I think that's actually what's really hard for people to understand, right? It's not one incident, right? It's one, we'll call it bad mediation, right? That leads to a bunch of incidences concurrently or simultaneously. And so it's not like you can just reverse the one action and not eat the apple. Like that actually wouldn't work because the eating of the apple is connected to all kinds of other things. And that's part of what the story is supposed to show you, right? That particular story is supposed to show you can't do one thing. Like you can't eat the apple, because you also get the knowledge of good and evil. And you can't just get the knowledge of good and evil because now you're naked, right? And you know, myriad of other things. But like all of these things are directly causally connected. And that's actually sort of key to understanding the idea. It's not like, oh, I did this one thing, what's the big deal? It's like, well, everything's connected. So when you do the one thing, all these other things happen as a result of, right? And that's, you know, important to keep in mind, because you can't just do one thing in the world. Everything you do affects other people, and affects nature, and affects your internal self, right? And usually your external self. Yeah, you know, it is that interconnectedness that's in the diagrams, but also it fractally scales. And so harming yourself harms your community for sure, right? To what degree is a different question, right? But it does do that. And it's that sense of, on the layer of analysis that you're at, a bunch of things change. You can't change one thing, and that changes things up and down. And that's where, you know, that's where that's where the book comes in handy. You're supposed to get the pattern from the symbols, and it's hard because they're pictures, they're flat drawings, and that's part of why the text is there to help guide us along.
I was thinking about
Yeah.
Oh, please go.
Oh, I was thinking it's the way what happens when they, you know, willfully eat the fruit that they were explicitly told not to eat. You willfully do the sinful thing, whatever, and all the relationships get broken. Basically, the mediation is disrupted between, you know, Adam and God, Adam and Eve, Adam and the earth, you know, and even Adam and himself.
Yeah, and
That's like 4 layers of analysis. There's levels there, so.
Yeah, and then they keep branching out like a bad tree. You know, it's like you get this. I think in the tradition it's something like there was like 7 or 8 major sins that were committed by Eve, and then it was like Adam is responsible for all of those plus another 5 or 6 or something like that, and then it's like all simultaneously, right? So it's just like, okay, you got disobedience, you've got usurpation, you've got impiety. You've got making Eve into an idol because he's listening to her, even though he literally got the direction exactly from God. And it's like, okay, you already got the directions, and then you're hearing from somebody else. And then, you know, and then it's a secondhand authority because it's coming from an even lower messenger as well. And then it's like, okay, also you ate something you weren't ready for. And then you went and you put the blame on your wife, and then blamed God for making her in the first place. And then you, like, you know, dress yourself in something ridiculous and say, oh, I'm naked, which is also making yourself a judge. So you usurped again. And it's like, you know, he sees like your molecules and he's like, what? You know, like, oh, we did this because we're naked. It's like, dude, leaves aren't going to change that, you know? But it's like all of those different levels are just so ridiculous. But also there's that aspect of, like, you know, when you had the diagram a while back of the, like, looking up, looking down, and looking forward, where it's like when you're just looking forward into that arena, it's like you're just seeing all of this other stuff and then reacting to just this stuff. And then it's like with every reaction, close if you're like identifying against all these other little things, that you're fighting all these tiny little wars all at once. And it's like, yeah, it's too much.
So yeah, like I like this idea that there's God through Adam connects to Eve, right? And then you have the opposing pattern where the snake connects through Eve to Adam, right? So there's like a buffered inversion there. And
Well, that's also improper mediation, right?
right.
Yeah, because he's trying to take the horizontal, the layer he's in, and knit it together with something higher from below, which is completely wrong in every possible way.
And so the first reaction is that he doesn't take responsibility, right? So he's connecting the causality not back to himself. And before we started here, I was listening something about regret, right? And like what is the means to repent, right? Because like that's effectively what happened, right? Like there was a bump in the road, right? Like there was a glitch in the system, and now we're supposed to restore the glitch, right? And so in his reaction, right, like the pointing away and the covering up, all of these things, what he's actually doing is he's covering the flaw, right? Like he's hiding the flaw between layers of cope, right, or whatever. Like he's attending to different layers of functionality instead of actually looking at where the problem occurred, right? And so I want to bind this to regret, right? Because I saw this response to regret where it's basically, yeah, like I don't want to regret because I stand behind the decision I made in the past, right? Because that was the right decision in the moment. And it's like, well, if you do that, right, like you start buffering, like you start creating these buffers that disallow you to take responsibility and to fully see, but more importantly, feel the implications, right? And like, so that's the nakedness, right? Like you don't allow yourself to be naked. It's like to face reality, to face the facts, and then take the step forward, right? And instead, like all the covering happens, all the and then when you're covered and you keep walking, right? Like now you carry that, right? Like you drag the past with you into the future instead of that you've cleansed yourself, right? Like you've let it wash away from you so that you can start afresh.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick, Manuel. Buffered's not a bad way to think about it. But one thing to consider with buffered is if you're being buffered, someone or something else is paying the cost. And then another way to think about this buffering is instead of buffered is it's not the opposite by any means, right? It's just a different way of looking at it. You're setting yourself apart, right? You're setting yourself outside of the consequences, right? You're sidestepping them. And either way is fine. Like I'm not privileging one or the other. It just some people might be able to see it better from the other side. Like you're stepping away from the connection that you have to the thing that you did, right? Which is a consequence. Like everything you did is consequence, and you're stepping away from that or trying to, right? Jordan Peterson, right? You never get away with anything. That sort of thinking. But at least in the moment, it seems to work. And buffering is the same analogy, right? In the moment, it seems to work, right? But somebody or something else is paying that cost. And that may come back in a way that you might not like in either case. But I think, separating also, obviously that's more intimacy crisis-y. So I wanted to point out that way of thinking about it too, in case it was helpful to anybody.
Yeah. And a different means to describe that is that the snake, right, or the change that I'm going through forced me into this response, right? So like I was obliged to have this relationship as a consequence of the snake talking to me.
That reminds me a lot of the you get, and I think this is something that came up in one of Mark's recent commentaries, this aspect of like trying to qualify something before or after you say it. It's like, no offense, but or, oh, I don't want to come off as rude, but, or whatever. It's like, no, just say the thing. Like the amount of times that I've gone and or it's like, oh, I'm sorry for bothering you, or what, like, just, yes, like, I'm bothering you, like, just like, I realize that it's not a good situation, but like there's times when like I had to work night shift on something, and I had to call somebody who was on call, and like, you have to call them and their spouse wakes up to the phone ringing, and you have to explain to them that they have to wake up their spouse and tell them to go to work at 3 a.m. or something like that. You don't say, oh, I'm so sorry, or whatever. It's like, look, I'm calling because unfortunately I have to ruin your night. Like, that's just, it's better to just show up naked, right, on the phone. Like, it just be like, okay, this is the situation. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and everything. Like, it sucks, and that's just what's happening here. Because in the end, like, that buffer that you're trying to set for yourself is eventually just, it's just creating more cost for that person.
Right, and like I actually had that buffering thing happen today to me, and like you can get lost in the buffer, right? Like that's the other thing, right? It can just like create this cloud of confusion, because I often have that, and right, and then like people refuse to take a stand, right? Then you're just chasing their tail, and it's like, no, like stand still. It's like I can't do anything unless you take a stand.
Yeah, it's the correct response to like knowing that you have sinned whatever is to confess and repent, which is the exact opposite of what happens in Genesis, what they do in Genesis 3. So
yeah, and there's a certain time frame within which it's like appropriate to do that, and that like there's like kind of compounding interest sometimes. Like the momentum continues going, and then there's a certain point where it's like, okay, maybe you actually could turn back and do that. But it's gotten like there's so much dead wood now that will you actually do, like, it is, if you couldn't even do it when there was no dead wood, right? And now there is, like, are you more likely to do that? And like the tradition holds that, like, Adam cried and repented for 900 years or something like that. And it's like, yes, okay, like he did his time and stuff, but also like it could have been less, and like, fair enough, no frame of reference, right? Like no parents to tell you about how they screwed something up or whatever and kind of give some context or anything. But it's like, that level of contrast is needed, I guess. Like you need 900 years of contrast if there's nothing before you,
Fair enough. So I like this idea, right? Like so that's the thing that we're often neglecting, right? Is accruing of that wood, right? So the thing that we're dragging along, and it's like, so I did the bad choice at a point, right? And I got these consequences, and that made me into the person that I am now, right? It's like, yeah, but like, what person would you be if you had the strength to resist that in the moment? Like, have you ever thought about like that potential, right? Like what is the thing you said no to instead of like the result that you've tasted? Um, because like there seems to be this illusion that if you say no to something, then you're missing out on something that builds your character or something, right? It's like, no, like the saying no is building your character, right? And like the harder it is to say no in some level, the more it requires of you, right? So in some sense, it makes you more truly you, because like it draws in to the deepest parts of you, because like they all have to join to resist the temptation that's in front of you.
And I think some of that is kind of like the just goes to the necessity of like attending to these things early and often. And you think of kind of the thing of like, okay, you're going to like someone overworks an arm muscle or something like that, and they tear it, and it's just like, okay, yeah, like if you didn't address the rest or something like that, or you didn't properly like mediate whatever sort of weight this person who's in the gym is doing this thing, then yes, you can actually engage in growth. Like if you said, okay, I'm going to stop here, that's appropriate or whatever, I know what the limits are, I'm going to do this, and then just kind of like the person who is saying no to some sort of temptation, while it's light, then yeah, you engage with that early and often, burn the dead wood super quick and everything. But then if you wind up going and waiting for a super long time, and it's like, oh, I'm going to do it all at once, or you haven't been saying no, and then it just happens to you, and it's like some sort of thing shows up, someone else's fault because people were peopling and they created the problem for you or something like that, and then you weren't prepared and you get knocked off, and then it's your fault, right? Because it was still your improper mediation, but then you hadn't built up the strength by fighting those tiny little like baby step battles early on. So. I like the part here. I think we had briefly discussed like a long time ago in this the thing about the one type of sin always implies the other. It's the last sentence of the top paragraph. And just kind of thinking of like the Nebuchadnezzar story, just that aspect of like, he has the dream, he's afraid of things falling apart, like the way that he's running things are eventually going to wind up falling apart, and it turns out like it was actually just one generation away, like it was actually coming up real quick. But he goes and he overcorrects and sins through too much straightness, and then he winds up, eating grass in the field like a goat for like 2 months or something. And it's like there's the sort of implication of the two of like, okay, you're trying to overcompensate for too much left-handedness by going full tilt right-handed, and then now because you did that, you became stiff and brittle and then shattered, and now all you've got left is the left-handed behavior, and then you just got this ridiculous kind of like pendulum swinging going on there.
Right. So we've been talking a lot about people trying to act on layers of analysis that they can't influence or whatever, right? And so if you identify the problem, like even correctly, like you might actually be correct about that the problem is in existence in a layer that you can't affect, right? But then like if you have that then inform you, right? Like then you end up reflecting this, right? So you can see that in the left and right spectrum of the political engagement, right? So you have it should be extremely loose, and then it's like, oh no, it needs to be extremely tight. No, it should be extremely loose, and then you get this hyperbolic exaggeration where, right, and this is what I mean with getting lost, right? Like the truth gets lost in the pulling from both sides, and then the pulling becomes more important than any actual reality. And like I think the reason why the pulling becomes more important is because like the actual agency to affect anything isn't there, right? So like actually they realize on some level that they can't do, or they can't live up to their promise or whatever. Like they can't affect the change that they're proposing, and so like it ends up gaining a spiritual reality, or like that becomes disconnected from the actual things that they should be doing.
Yeah, on that, I've noticed there's a tendency, especially if you're in thinking of a flat world or whatever, people tend to jump to this idea where they think a reaction to something is a correction for it. And that's actually obviously not true if you pay attention, but that's hard to do a lot of times. So
Oh yeah, that's a good catch. Yeah, I mean, reacting to things may be required, but that may not fix anything. And then so the reaction may be the least of the requirements when something happens, right? It's a good point because people don't think about that. They, we're more symmetrical, right? We like this equality doctrine stuff. We really think the world is symmetrical, and you can just undo things, and I'm not saying that never happens, but almost never, and so we shouldn't think of most things that way.
I think a good example is actually a wire or something, right? And if you just unwind the spin, I guess, of wire, and you put it on the ground, and then you pick it up, and then there's like 15 nuts in there just because they like randomly got in there. So like the retangling on the wire is going to take a bunch more effort just because like randomness effectively. And well, I want to go into the idea of awareness, right? So like I had this woman talk to me about the rights of the Aboriginals in Australia or something, right? And then like I really had to agree with her, right? So there's this idea that like if I just get this awareness fixed, like if we just have everybody be aware. So another thing that's happened in the Netherlands is that they had awareness campaigns about psychological issues, right? Like autism or whatever. And so basically what they're trying to do was to like, well, if we just get people to be aware, then they can be empathetic and then they will react appropriate to the other people. And it's like, in what world does you knowing what's going on inside the other person allow you to have the right response? Like those two are not the same thing. Like I know what's going on inside of me sometimes. Like I don't have the right response to what's going on inside of me, let alone the right response to what's going on inside someone else.
Yeah, but it's the age of gnosis, man. So once you have the knowledge, it just all yeah. And people really confuse things like interpretation. Like I can know about the Aboriginals in Australia and come to very different conclusions about what's next or what should be next or even why, right? Because a lot of people just have a bad telos, right? If your telos is equality, I like that's not good. Like equality is not good. It doesn't solve the world. It doesn't make things better. We're not equal. We're not supposed to be equal. If we're all equal, you have no one to rely on in this world because no one's better than you and they can't lift you up. And that sounds horrific to me. I don't want that to happen. And
Mark, there's pillows everywhere. Why do you want to be lifted up? You can just lay on the pillow.
Yeah. But we don't account for that, right? We're looking at the alleged upside only and not at the whole picture. And so we're not really getting a sense for the fact that I mean things are supposed to be different for different people, and that's actually the correct way to go about this.
It reminds me of, so there's a couple of things that came up for this. So the one thing about like, assuming that there is, first of all, a right response and that you can know it, and that the other person is actually going to have that same telos and actually be seeking the right response. I remember there was some guy that made some sort of joke thing. It was like, and it was kind of like lampooning the age of gnosis stuff, where it's like, learning 47 different languages and cultures so that he could be more effectively racist and all those different things or something like that. And it's just like, yeah, exactly. Like, it's like the starting axiom is so wrong, but he's like, yeah, super genius has put all of his time and effort into this. But then you look at like that aspect of the Aboriginal affairs all the way down in Australia, and it's like, I remember, I think it was a conversation that Manuel had a while back where there was this thing of like, oh, I need to know what's going on with the war that's going on in like at the border of my country or something like that. It's like, because there's a farm there where I get food from, and that has now been annexed by the other country or something like that. And it's just like, okay, first of all, like if you're going to address that, assume you even had the ability, which is already not the case. But like, assume you even had the ability, it's like the wire that Manuel described, where it's just like what got it to the point that's there isn't necessarily like that doesn't have to happen in reverse, assuming you could even do that. Like now there's all these other knots. But also it's like as far as you're concerned, you get out of the way or you find another place to get bread. Like that's about as far as you can go. And maybe like it does become more severe at that point. You have to make a different response, but it's like how much can you actually change until there's more to respond to? And that still assumes that you're actually capable and that you're doing it correctly.
Well, yeah, that goes into healing, right? And the role of the snake, right? So, like the snake is the impetus for setting things in motion, right? And so, like that paradise or perfect order can't be maintained anymore, and um, because perfect order can't be maintained, like now we need to find a new order, right? So it's like to go back to the examples, like, well, yeah, maybe finding a new baker is gonna be the answer. Like maybe that baker don't exist and you have to flee. Like, so yeah, like the level on which that solution happens, right, is different, right? But you might say, well, oh no, I need to become the baker or something, right? And then the next day the soldiers are at your doorstep. So like there's ways in which you can start articulating the answer that's wholesome, and then there's ways that you can start articulating the answer that's stubborn, right? Like in Dutch, we have the word own wisdom. Like, so you do it by your own wisdom. Like, I know better. Like, I can do this bakery stuff. And you're just ignoring all the other signs in the world that just tell you to get out. So, um, yeah, and I think, well, that's the thing that I wanted to get into, right? So it's talking about the external sin and the internal sin. So maybe we want to get some examples going on the way that they relate, that they connect.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I'm familiar with is a sort of aspect of like that your words follow your thought patterns, and that your actions follow what you're speaking, and it's kind of this thing of like you can kind of what is it like you speak out of the abundance of your heart, something like that, and that like if you're speaking those things, you're starting to manifest those things, and you start to act them out. And so there is that sort of aspect of like you think of and I think Jordan Peterson has talked about this, the thing of you get students who have like ideological professors, and those professors want a certain type of response on an essay or something like that, and that the students don't actually believe that, but they know what gets an A. And then so they start manifesting these papers that have the answers that this other person wants, and that eventually they actually wind up ideologically indoctrinating themselves just by participating in those patterns and by submitting that stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's a really difficult thing, but also there is that sort of aspect of like and this is also, it's kind of like external into internal and then external again, and it's like, but that comes to mind with this aspect of like, okay, you see the thing, you decide, and I guess we're getting into the fruit stuff in the next chapter, but you see the thing, you eat it, and then now it's an internal issue, and then now you've got all of these things that are going to start coming out externally. Like it's the stuff that comes out of man that defiles him, type of thing.
Yeah, but that made me think of this swearing. I feel like the amount of swear words somebody uses probably is a reflection of their internal states, and that comes out externally.
It's like left-handed speech, a little bit. It's like, yeah, there's not like a clear unity in it, and it's not like really straight to the point. It's kind of like it's taking a roundabout way of making your point, and usually it's coming from a place of like emotion or something like that.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, right? So what I'm looking at is what is the game that you're playing, right? Or like what is the purpose that you're pursuing? Right? So Castle was basically pointing at the idea that if you have an authority as a teacher setting up not so much the rules of the game, but the rules of grading the game, right? Because those are not the same thing. um, and you're looking to get to the end of the game, right? In other words, you get your paper and get a job. You're gonna attune differently, right? And in this attunement now, the world will lay itself out to you, right? So like a natural consequence of trying to get a good grade would be to go to ChatGPT, because like ChatGPT can help you uh, pro- provide the right product that's going to be graded, right? So um, to go back to this idea of Adam and Eve, right? So like you could say, right, it's like, okay, are we playing the blame game? Are we playing the game of does the problem even exist? Like what is what is the game that we're playing that will lay the world out in, lay the world lay itself out for you in a manner like what are the things that you can see as a consequence of that, and like what are the things you'll end up being blind to as well, right? um and so another way is like, okay, like when we're talking about self indoctrination, right? Like what does that mean? Well, that means that you lose your grounding, right? Like you can't, you're no longer grounded in your own purpose. Like you're grounded in a purpose that is inherited from the authority structure that doesn't care, right? Because like the grades on your paper like doesn't care about you actually knowing anything. Like it doesn't care about how you got the paper. Like it doesn't care about any of these things. And so you end up with interfacing with like a dead system instead of bringing something alive, right?
Mm. And I think sometimes there's a necessity for also, like, once again, the sort of double negative thing. Like, I think there's an aspect of, like, if you have normally proper mediation and then something winds up knocking that out, like some sort of emergency happens. And say, that, with the aspect of, like, someone who never uses swear words. Like, everyone knows that they're in a room with people that, like, everyone knows that this person just never swears or anything like that. Something happens, that person who never swears needs to get everyone's attention. If they use a swear word modestly, everyone, like, they have everyone's attention for whatever emergency came up. Whereas if it's a person that is always griping and complaining and cursing and all this stuff like that, then it's just, oh, that's just what they do, and so that's
And the
just
inverse might be true, right? If they don't swear,
yeah
people might pay attention. Like,
yeah.
I think a lot of that is with the swearing and the having to write an ideological paper, whatever. What happens there is like your attention is slowly being like diverted or shifted in a certain direction, and that's the way that happens. Is it's kind of like what the serpent does. Did God really say? And you just do repeat that over and over again, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, you can get way off course.
Yeah.
Just one degree at a time.
Yeah, it's like when you say a word too many times and that stops like really having its meaning, And it's that same sort of thing where it's like if you could have some swear word that's just like unheard of in any company or whatever, that that's just so inappropriate. But then you get like some Scottish guy that just uses it constantly, and it's like, oh, that's just normal. Like that's as normal as like a Valley girl saying like in between the other words. Like there's no real difference there. It's not even offensive anymore. But then again, like that also kind of, it is destroying the language a bit. Like if people start mimicking that, that it's just like you can't take that elsewhere. Otherwise, you're impure food. I don't want to like too far into the next chapter, but like you become impure food for whatever other place you enter into.
But that's why language is regional and not universal. And most of the complaints against language and most of the examples of, well, this word doesn't really mean that, and therefore I can redefine it, are based on regional differences and and reasonable regional differences, and not based on some, we'll say, lasting principle or pattern, which is what this book is more about. That tells you something about the nature of reality, right? It just tells you something about the implementation of that pattern in that place for reasons. And they're very often really good, easy to understand reasons. I guess that's more in the realm of maybe anthropology is the science that talks, mostly about that. But I might be wrong about that. But there are ways to understand, people who live in the mountains talk this way and use words this way because, right? And there's that famous thing. It's not entirely true, but the fact that Eskimos have like 11 words for snow, and it's like, well, they have a bunch of relationships and they use that, and they all involve snow. It's not exactly the same thing, but the flavor is there, right? Like, yes, the way you use the language regionally has to change, and it's very hard to draw human universals from that. And the people that are doing that are living in that flat world again.
And I want to point out a different way that the language gets changed, right? So there's this word policing, right? It's like things like retard or whatever, like these words, they are deemed offensive, right? And then like you're not allowed to use this word, like use this word instead, right? And like what happens is that the original meaning, right? Because like the words were there for a reason, because they like were descriptive of a reality, and then they get detached, right? And they get flattened, and so like you start having a more and more removed description of reality, and now we can't relate to the original thing anymore, right? Because there's like this fuzzy category that doesn't really get like pointed at with the word, right? And like the confusion that was in one's head, right? The person that got insulted, right? Because they're confusing the moral implications of the word with the factual description, gets integrated in society, right? And so like now it becomes a societal confusion instead of a personal confusion.
Yeah, that reminds me of like there's something that would come up a lot of times doing like music classes and stuff where the music teachers were hesitant to use certain words. And like one of them was, especially like if you're playing a horn instrument or something, you retard the note. There's an actual like technique involved in slowing and making the sound deeper. And that was an actual like technique that you do in certain circumstances, and then it's just like you have to like brace, the person has to like brace for impact every time they say that. It's like, yeah, you just ruined all of the other possible contexts in which this is usable. And then even like I remember I told Mark this, it was something that it caught me off guard, but it's like it made sense. And it was like Saint Irenaeus, like 2nd century, goes and he writes in his demonstration of the apostolic preaching, he says we must not allow ourselves to become retarded. He actually says that, but he means like in our apostolic preaching we must not let ourselves get slowed down. It's like, but he says the word that they translated into English as most appropriately was, you must not retard the process of apostolic preaching. It's like, but you lose all that when you take certain things and then set them aside. And so there is that aspect of kind of like, when you hear the sound, everyone has to kneel, and it's just like, no, you wind up just making more and more things difficult. And now everyone has to like, walk on eggshells.
Wait, and that's an extremely useful word in English, actually, retard.
Yeah.
They use it in, talking about timing in a car all the time, right? And things like that, because there isn't a substitute for it, right? You have to use at least 2 more words than just the one word that actually has a succinct, well-known meaning, and all because of some slang that was used by people to express something true. This person's a little slow. Okay, fair. And like, you didn't get rid of those people making fun of those people. All you did was change the language they used and made everybody else's life miserable, and removed meaningful words from the lexicon.
Yeah, and it creates like an arms race of sorts, where it's like they just start creating more terms over and over again. You see this with like platforms like YouTube and stuff go, and they censor certain words, and then people are just putting in numbers and periods and exclamation points and stuff, and like just doing all these things to like still use the word. And it's just like, now someone who's identifying against this, or is being paid to identify against this thing, now has to think about all of the 10 billion ways you could possibly misspell this thing so that you could ban it.
And like, more importantly, right, like now you've created, just like the test, right, you created an ecosystem or whatever, like something around this thing that like shouldn't be an issue in the first place, right? But now, because you made it an issue, you attracted trolls effectively, that are living under the principality of trying to get rid of this. And they're playing this game, right? And I've been talking a lot about, like, it's the age of gnosis thing, right? Like, if we just know this extra thing, then like we'd all like get along, right? And so like what ends up happening is like there's a domain, right? It's like, like for example with the COVID or whatever, right? Like there's this domain, and then everybody's running around like trying to sort out the details of COVID, right? And it's like, they don't matter, right? Because they're not gonna change the response, right? Like the response to COVID was fairly high level, right? And either that was appropriate or inappropriate. And like having like things calculated to like 15 marks behind the comma isn't gonna change the answer that you're gonna give, right? So and everybody's pursuing this, right? They're pursuing these answers as if they're gonna break some mold or something that is holding back the truth, and like that's just not going to happen.
It's like the thing with like like the Soviet informants and stuff like that, where it's just like, we're, and like the same thing, like actually the same thing happened with the lockdown stuff. Like, this person's having a birthday party and someone actually calls the police on them. And it's like, those sorts of things totally happen. And there's this aspect of kind of like, going so far into the right, and it's like, okay, yes, I'm going to straighten this out and police everything. I'm going to take onto myself the authority of this thing, and then ultimately like that belies or implies like actually the worst of all vices, which is pride. And it's just like the fact that you have so little going on that you're looking at all these other people and also taking like major actions against them, where it's like, really, you don't have other stuff that like you have to be attending to, not like that you could. It's like you're probably neglecting something by spending time on it.
Right, and this goes into the more information won't help, right? And more information won't change things. And additional stats and figures on what happened or what might happen or what might have happened is not going to change the rightness or the wrongness of something like a lockdown, or using a reprehensible term like social distancing, which has no positive context, right? It's just an evil thing to say. Intimacy crisis confirmed. And people are looking for justification, right? Or looking to buffer themselves from the consequences, right? And they buffer themselves using more information. And they just get more information, more but this, but that, right? All the while making things worse, because the longer it takes you to do the confess, repent, do your penance cycle, entropy is still a factor. Time is a factor, and so it it actually makes things worse by allowing people to, quote, do this buffering or this separation, right? You're trying to put more information between you and your actions or inactions.
Yeah. Well, it's something that's kind of interesting, like within the Catholic tradition, the thing of the confessing and penance aspect is if you do an incomplete confession, like not like, oh, you remembered every single thing, but it was like if you had 3 things to confess that were like serious, and you only mentioned 2 because you're embarrassed of the first one, you don't just leave with 2 forgiven things and 1 thing on the table. And you don't leave with 3 major things. You leave with 4 because you omitted it and also it wasn't valid. And then there's also the aspect of you're given a penance, but if you wait 4 weeks to do it, like that's also invalidating the entire thing because you weren't serious. And it's never something hard either. Like, that's the thing.
In other words, having the relationship be healthy is more important than what's in the relationship.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on the last page? Hopefully it'll be a quick one. Is somebody able to restate their understanding of the last sentence in the second paragraph and what just mostly the part of the paradox of the snake and naming it incorrectly? Just like how you guys understood that.
So we talked about the snake being above, right? And so the snake being above means that you designated its position wrong, right? Because snakes should be on the ground because like they're on the ground. And so if you lift something that's supposed to be on the ground up as above you, in other words, having authority over you, right? Allowing it to dictate to you, then you misname it, right? You misunderstand the role that the snake is fulfilling, right? And if you misunderstand the role, right, then you assume a wrong relationship with the snake. And yeah, that kind of goes into what I was going to introduce. It's like, what is the question, right, that you're asking, right? You gotta formulate the engagement that you're in correctly. But yeah, I'll leave that lay for a bit. Maybe other people want to have.
I mean, what was your understanding? I mean, all of these are just, showing the sequence, right?
I just didn't have a super concrete one. That's why I was asking.
Well, I think
I just didn't understand what you meant by paradox of the snake. But we don't have to linger too much on it. But
Well, the other part that the snake did, right? He's basically, right. I don't know if that's really the paradox. Yeah, I'll leave it.
Well, so Olena, if I understand right, your question was specifically about like with Adam's mediation being between heaven and earth, his sins have repercussions at all levels. Is that right?
I'm asking. I was kind of asking like, how was it that he named the snake incorrectly? And that seems to tie in to the paradox of the snake.
Yeah.
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 But what you all said was helpful enough for me to think on that and see it from that perspective.
Well, the other thing that the snake is time, right? So it's the impetus for change, right? So I think the paradox, right, is like the stumbling stone, right? It's the introduction of something that cannot be contained in what you already know, right? Or what your current reality effectively, and so that creates a paradox, right? Because the world is bigger than your understanding of the world, and so now you need to change, right, in order to accommodate for this bigger reality, because else you'll just like end up in sin and like forever.
Another way to look at this is Adam. We don't know what the snake is before it becomes a snake, so it wasn't named, in essence, right? But whatever it was elevating itself by being on the tree and speaking as either an equal or something above. And Eve takes this as something above, right? Like if a lion comes up to you and says, "Hey, man, you should kill your neighbor," you're gonna look at the lion and go, "You're a lion, go away," right? Like that's kind of the point. Like there are things below, and so they elevate the snake because it doesn't have a name, right? And that's how it becomes a snake. We elevate whatever it is before it's a snake because it hasn't been, we'll say, properly named. So the mediation hasn't occurred. So that's the paradox. It's you shouldn't listen to something with no name. And the theme of listening to something with no name is absolutely everywhere in media, right? Or maybe something not necessarily quote no name, but an improper name or a suspicious name, or a name isn't representative. That's in a lot of movies and books.
So
Yeah.
well, I was just going to say really quick that there's also this aspect of, okay, if the snake doesn't have a name or anything, you can also, at least by understanding that you were, like, Adam is given a name. So, like, he doesn't have to name himself. He already has a name. He's not recognizing the dignity and office that comes with that name. And the fact that he was already charged with the responsibility of naming the animals. So this is another thing that does require naming. It doesn't have a name yet. Your job is supposed to be going and doing that. And the fact that it's something that's available to be named means that it is below you. So there is this sort of aspect of, and I think this is kind of like a recurring theme that just happens with like day-to-day life as well, that people forget, like, okay, the dignity of your existence as office of human, is much higher than whatever nonsense you're doing right now. So like you're improperly, like it isn't even that much about naming these other things. It's like, are you properly attending to the name that you were given? And if you're doing that, then yes, you're just simply not going to do this other stuff.
Right. And that's the answer to the age of gnosis, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that was helpful. The only thing that's still a little bit out of line is the fact that the snake shouldn't be above or in the tree, because the curse, after all of this, the curse of the snake was that it would crawl on its belly. So I don't know. I feel like that's significant, but not sure in what way yet. But this was helpful. We should go to the next.
Yeah, we'll get to it. I want to point out this a little bit, right? So we have above the graph here, we have the personalities that are related to time, right? So you have anti-establishment, recreational, revolutionary, clowns, magicians, actors, spies, turncoats, right? So what's common among all of these? That you can't really name them. They're like two-faced, right? So they're presenting in one way, but that's not who they really are. If that makes sense, right? Or like as a revolutionary or anti-establishment is like, okay, so they're promoting something, right? So they're trying to manifest something, but you don't know what it is because it hasn't manifested yet. It's just a promise, right? And so there's in those identities is like, well, like what do you think about a magician, right? Like do you think as them as someone who's just like providing you with a service, right? And it's like, oh, I just get a nice tune. Or are they an idol that you worship? Because that's what all the fangirls and fanboys do, right? They go up to this character that's like providing some music and like they think they're God effectively. And so like what is the proper place of these things that you can't immediately find a proper name for? And like Castle said, it's just like remembering who you are, right? Like what are these things doing for you? not what are you doing for them, right? Like there's a, yeah, like if you mess up the relationship to these things, right? Like to these agents of change effectively, then you will get swept up in the change, right? And then the change becomes a purpose in and of itself, right? And then like you end up getting lost necessarily, like it's not an option.
Yeah, just before we move on, again, I just want to reiterate, the snake has to crawl on its belly. It can no longer raise itself up in the same way, right, without revealing its limitations. And that's why that's important, right? Because its order has been lowered from something, we'll say, able to climb a tree, we'll say with ease or something, to a snake, which yeah, they can kind of climb trees, sort of, maybe, but also it's pain for snakes to climb trees, and it's obvious that they're snakes, right? Whereas, for all we know, this may have looked, like a 4-foot tall lizard laying in the tree, because lizards lay in trees all the time, and so it was harder to discern that this is a lesser creature. But when it crawls on its belly, it's definitely a lesser creature.
I want to quickly point out also the aspect that, like, in terms of justice, like the punishment fits the crime. So like you cause instability, you lose your stability. So like if you had legs, and it's just like, oh, now you're forced, like you wind up, if you were standing on pillars, for example, or you had some sort of stabilizing ability, like it kind of follows that you wind up losing that stability as a consequence. And something that kind of came up, I remembered hearing something about this. I don't know if it would be possible to zoom in on this a little bit. But so this is a picture of a snake that was found. It's a snake fossil that was found in Brazil. But let me see if I can show. Super old snake fossil. And see those little feet? There's these tiny little feet on this guy. That fossil was just found in 2015.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Bam. Yeah, so I also want to point out, right, like when the snake is on the tree, the snake is inheriting the stability from the tree, right? Like it's using the tree to be erect or to be high. And like I think traditionally that is the tree with the fruit as well, right? Like I don't even know if that's in the story, but so there's at least the implication that apart from like the physicality, that there's also a spiritual inheritance from that tree that the snake has.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like the bronze serpent on the stake, and it was I remembered seeing there was it was a dramatic sort of, or like a dramatization of that sort of scene that was there, and like it was sort of unambiguously set up that it's just like, yeah, in order to actually affix a bronze serpent on a stake, like it has to have like a crossbeam, in order for it to kind of attach it, and so there is the sort of aspect of like, okay, if you actually want that thing to be on there, like if you just had a pole, like you're not going to see a normal snake, to Mark's point, of them just like spiraling around it and easily climbing up the thing.
So the other thing that I'm now thinking about, because we've been talking about the axle, right? So like the tree is in the center of the garden, right? And now the time is on the tree, right? So like then we flip it, right? And we create a new space, if that makes sense, right? With an unknown center, right? So you basically, to go with Pageau's thing, you open the door to the meta garden or something.
Yeah, I guess before we move on to the next chapter, one of the sentence at the individual level, internal sin means doing something that goes against personal convictions. I've always felt that that concept, I've always felt that it's unfortunate that your relationship to things is an under discussed subject in churches or in Christian groups in general, because I've always found it from personal experience to be very important. I'm like, for example, I can name or list many things that trigger me, like, like I despise disorganization or laziness or apathy or certain forms of mediocrity at work or anything that's hypnotic, like scrolling, etc. Uh, Poor music, TVs, thinking too much, not doing, and the reason is because of a certain awareness of seeing the cost of what these behaviors lead to. You know, um, I mean, we could get into an exposition of this in a more detailed manner in terms of like who I am. Like the primary attribute of a warrior archetype, for example, is like having blinders on or conserving your energy, like a horse going into battle. Or if you think of the image of a samurai or a monk, they're excluding a lot of noise. But like the idea of having a bad relationship with your own mind terrifies me for very deep reasons I could talk about. And because of how I've been formed in life, like I think about certain things that other people think are trivial, like maybe pop music, for example, which other people would consume, that I have like life and death level of, of a stance toward. But I've always found it unfortunate that this idea of your personal convictions toward thing, we don't have proper, very good tools, I think, to discuss. And I've found that subject to be underutilized. Like, on like the vulgar language, for example, like if I say like turn that shit music off or stop watching that bullshit show, it's because I mean it. And if your reaction is, oh, he used a bad word, I think that there's something inside of you that's missing what I see, for example. I mean, that's just maybe like one example. But also on the note of awareness, like Manuel was speaking to the note of empathy. But when it comes to things like addictions and things, part of this worldview and life experience is being aware of how behaviors that you're engaged in and thoughts that you're engaged in mold you. And again, like none of this, it's a procedural thing, and almost none of this stuff is ever like discussed from a church pulpit. So I find it interesting that he highlights that as an important aspect of sin, because this is definitely not a mainstream. Like if you go to 90% of churches in America, you're not going to have people defining sin this way.
It's interesting.
Well, that's the intimacy crisis right there, right? And that's why it's so big, right? That's what the split is. The church thinks we just bring everybody to church and everything will be solved. The church is so materialistic and individualistic and objective, or at least willing to play in that space. That's what apologetics is. It's not only that, but it's also the willingness to play the scientific rationality game or something. That they don't see the danger to themselves, and bringing everybody to church is not going to work. It's not universally true for all churches or anything, but also it's not going to work. It's definitely not going to work at a scale that's sufficient, because the churches have the same intimacy crisis disease, right? And because they don't have a full enough model of what the attack actually was, we'll say. And that's actually super important to understand. I mean, that's the whole purpose of navigating patterns. It's the whole purpose of my channel, right, is to talk about that at that scale in the right way, using the right language, and starting to hear more of that same language being used in other circles. But for sure, that's the problem. We're not talking about relationship. We're not talking about connectedness. We're not talking about things outside, right? Everybody's talking from the middle out, from my perspective, out to the world side. So when they do talk about relationships, they're linear and discrete, and it's from you out to the world. And occasionally it's the other way, but this is why this book is important, right? Because symbolic way of thinking is no, there's no single connections anywhere, right? And that has profound implications for things like sin. And also there's this time thing, or entropy, if you want to be scientific about it, and that's a factor, right? And no one talks about that. They just act like everything's sort of like happening in the here and now, and everything's okay, and we can reverse things because everything's equal. You're right, Danny. The churches talk like that, and that's a big, big problem.
I remember seeing and like it's rare. Like I saw, so as far as like the describing a relationship thing, I saw there was this one. it was like a big like shrine type of place, like very, very, very large grounds type of place that they had. And they had a talk where they were talking about specifically, it was like the history of rock music and pop music with the and the relationship between the artist, their music, and the people that were kind of consuming it. And there's this aspect of, they kind of described like, look, some of these people, like famous people who made a lot of music, like explicitly said in interviews that they believed that they actually were like receiving inspiration from like bad spirits for their music, like explicitly said that in like public interviews and stuff. And it was this kind of thing of not like, oh, we're going to like, wag our fingers at you for this stuff, but it's like, are you aware that you're listening to music that these people explicitly said that's how they got their inspiration? And do you like, if a person is in a sort of thing where they have a sort of emotional response or emotional attachment to this type of media, do you recognize the difference when you're listening to that type of stuff versus like classical music versus like, sacred music or something like that? Can you kind of like recognize how you relate to that? And then also like how sort of like Mark talks about, oh, if you look at a philosopher and then like they have some philosophy, but then they lived a horrible life. It's just like, okay, well, if you're taking advice from like a rock star or something like that, or if you're listening to the same lyrics on repeat, like, more or less agreeing with them or even singing to them, like the thing with the professor setting the conditions for the grade. If you're singing along to these things, like how much of that is getting in subconsciously? And then also there's the condition of the person who made it, and then wherever the heck they got that from, And it's like, yeah, I don't hear much about that often, but that was only one scenario where I noticed that someone did that well enough, Danny.
I think if you were to drill into the idea of like a personal conviction, I mean, there's a difference between something that's arbitrary versus cause and effect relationship of things. Like the church might say something like guard your heart, mind, and soul, right? But I mean, it's in the detail of the exemplification of embodying that kind of a thing where that is important. And I think that's an area of weakness of the church in general. I mean, you could give just simple things of understanding how humans work. Like this last week has probably been the best week for me in the last 2 years for a variety of reasons. I've been on like pretty deep into semen retention, and I've been on like monk mode type of protocols. So my mind is in a very good place, but I've been like suffering like mad. And in order to like for very like I could describe some, like last night I tried to go to sleep or 2 days ago, 7 o'clock, had like insane restless leg syndrome for like 2 hours. It's like torture. Get up, eat a tiny meal of nothing but steak and rice and salt, clean food, go back to bed at 9:30, restless leg till like 11:30. It's like 4.5 hours, right? And it's like mental torture. I mean, this is like I've always had like severe insomnia my whole life, but like simple tools could be like I didn't know. I wish somebody told me this earlier in life, is like once you understand certain aspects of how the body works and how the mind works and how energy can be leaked, like repeating mantras on the inhale and the exhale. Like I have certain things that I've like on the inhale that have like I have many things. One like enduring, and on the like about how the future will be better. But as I'm suffering, if I repeat certain processes, eventually things change, But I mean, this is just like a simple example of like there are I could talk all day long about small practical things. I could write a book on this probably, but this is sort of, but on the idea of even introducing the idea of a personal conviction towards something, it will also take certain things off the table. Like Olena brought up intoxication, like consuming something in a celebratory way is very different than consuming something in a coping way, for example. You know what I mean? And so I think it's unfortunate that we have such simple perspectives towards these things of like, oh, all like Dionysian bad. Like Dionysus, not necessarily bad. Dangerous, maybe, right? Should you touch it? I don't know, right? But there's room for maturity and more nuanced level of it, because these things are inevitable. Because if you don't address these, like we're surrounded, like look at the internet, anything digital. People are so hypnotized by all the digital stuff they engage in. Instagram is basically softcore porn, I mean, when you're posting on social media, what are you doing? Like, what is actually, motivating you? All kinds of stuff. Like, we're surrounded by Dionysian forces. And so by having this immature perspective towards it, it's more likely than that you're just going to be captured by it and not know it. But anyway, I'll stop it there because I could go on and on about this.
Yeah.
So,
Well, if I could just say real quick, there's an aspect as well of the sort of thing of doing something that is genuinely good, or like abstaining from something. You think like long-term fasting or something like that. And there are certain practices that are like, part of certain holidays that people do this as like a religious practice, and they'll say, okay, we're going to fast for the next 24 hours or 40 hours or something like that. And we'll do these things, and like that's good. Or it has the potential to be good, right? Like just the fact that you're doing something for religious purpose and that you're actually participating in it is not also necessarily fully qualifying that as good, because if you have a person who's like, oh, I'm a traditionalist and no one is doing this 40-hour fast, but me, I'm the one doing the thing. It would have been better for you if you just ate hamburgers the entire time. Like morally, it would have been better to just completely throw that away. But like if you can be humble and then also do that, then like 2 thumbs up, great. But also if you can't do that, then you shouldn't have even bothered in the first place. Like it was a waste of time and you didn't gain anything from it.
Right. So I wanted to respond to the conviction thing, right? So like one of the problems with conviction is that people confuse conviction with feelings, right? So like I feel really strongly about this, that's not the same as being convicted. And so staying true to your conviction is integrity, right? And so like if you sin against that, right, you basically deny yourself, right? You curse yourself, you break down that which makes you, right, which allows you to be. Um, so yeah, that's a really important issue, right? But if you stay true to your feelings and like assume that your feelings are convictions, right? Like now you're building on sand, right? Like you're holding on to something that can't hold you, and like it's gonna let you fall at some point. Um, And the other thing was that the example with using the harsh language, right, to say like put off that shit music or whatever, right? Like a couple things came up for me there, right? Because what is the problem? Like then he said, well, like they don't understand what I'm saying. It's like, well, yeah, maybe, right? But also I think a lot of responses there go to the tone policing. It's like why are you shit talking my music, or right? And so they're not engaging with the actual issue, right? And even if they engage with the actual issue, right? Like they don't have to engage with your perspective of it, or have to agree with it or disagree with it, because what actually needs to happen is like your authority needs to be accepted, right? Like you made a judgment call, and the harsh tone is actually a signal. It's like, no, like we're being serious, like we're not kidding at this point. Like you gotta turn it off, right? And you just have to listen to me even if you disagree, right? And like that's the part that people can't do, right? Like they just get stuck in so much whatever, because well, effectively their narcissism, right? Like, oh, like my interests are more important than you, right? And they're not even seeing that that's what they're doing, right? Like it's just their reflexive response. And in that, right, like the thing that has to happen, right? Because effectively what you're saying is you're creating a space that's not wholesome by having this music playing. And in order to make it wholesome again, like we need to adjust this, right? And so instead of privileging the communion and having the wholesome place, the the narrative gets changed, right? And now we're going to end up in a confusion, right? Like we're going to chase basically narratives or whatever, right? We're going to deal with demons instead of dealing with resolving the problem of lack of wholesomeness. And that's going to instigate more, yeah, more division as well, like that chasing the demons stuff.
Yeah, there's kind of an aspect of like, acting out the ideal, and then that sort of becomes the judge in a sense, and kind of like sets a sort of standard, and you don't see as much of the other negative behavior. Like it's a lot more difficult to start playing ridiculous, music with nasty lyrics or something like that in an area which is traditionally like sacred or very formal or something like that. Like if someone just pulls up like a a boombox in the middle of like a courtroom or something like that, it takes a lot more confidence to pull that off than in an apartment building or something like that. And so if you kind of set the standard in the environment by kind of acting out your part on the microcosm, like that also kind of sends a lot of signals, assuming you're actually sticking around in that area. I mean, that's the other difficult thing too, is like if you're in an area that isn't your home or workplace or something like that, and then setting up setting up ideals or pointing out like, diagnoses of this thing doesn't work correctly, or, oh, that's wrong, or something like that. Like it's very difficult to enforce if you're just not going to be there, like tomorrow or an hour later or something like that to check up on it.
Yeah, so that was a lot of mediation, I guess, that we pointed at. So who wants to take the fruit? I am definitely not a snake. I have self-identified as I have self-identified as a joker. um Yeah, so I don't have too much on the first page. Integration is digestion, right? Like there's a connection there. Like I think for me at least, reading this was mostly about familiarizing myself with the language. So it wasn't as much that there was much new there, but it's yeah. It was also, I don't know how to articulate it, but it was bringing in a perspective that I didn't really wield before, and it I don't know, like this is what I mentioned at the start. Like I did feel like there was something weird, like it kind of felt off in a way. Um, so like I'm still like, but like that's my issue with Matthieu's style, but like it seemed to be bumping into the same problem over and over again.
Are you able to articulate what it is? That's all.
I don't know. Like I do get the sense that he's flattening things, or like I don't know. Like it doesn't flow for me. So it's not. I guess it's not really mapping onto the way that I relate to things. So it's not that I don't recognize it, but if you'd asked me to write this, I would have done it differently. All right. And so I'm just like, why is it in this form? Like I'm just confused.
Now, I haven't read ahead in a long time, so I'm not sure. Like, I actually don't have an answer for that, but I do just, I guess, want to kind of point out that we're going back to some very old diagrams now. Like, we're taking a step back and looking at things again from like a different perspective with the same sort of graphics that we had before. But I guess something that stuck out for me is, like I was kind of aware of the aspect of okay, you integrate people, like that's sort of like a community or like intercommunal scale, trying to integrate things is a lot like hiring somebody or bringing somebody in, or like somebody entering into a family by marriage or something like that. But I hadn't really like stopped to put a lot of time into the whole digestion aspect of like the refinement that goes into that. So there is the sort of aspect of like assimilation and training and education and that sort of thing that takes place there. So I guess I'm just kind of I'm kind of formulating a few things on that, and then thinking about this aspect of intoxication, that there's some things that are just actually inappropriate within a given space. But it's not that it's inappropriate permanently, like cosmically or something like that. Like sometimes it's necessary or like okay to have someone that maybe in a broader sense, like you have a relationship with, some friend, but like that friend is just like, I remember a friend of mine talked about his friends that he's like, oh, you can't take them anywhere, and it's just like, but also they're his friends and everything. But it's like he knows that he can't take them anywhere because their behavior is just bad. That he can only interact with them within a small bubbles where they can't do damage, and if they do damage, it's to themselves or their own property or whatever. And it's like otherwise, it's we can still be friends, but like you can't come over, and like there's a lot. We have to have boundaries there, and that's okay. And like there's no hard feelings there. But yeah, just kind of thinking about that, and also the aspect of overeating. That sort of thing too. Like there is a sort of intoxication aspect. Like you can get water poisoning in a sense. Like I'm not sure if what the exact word of that is, but like you can drink too much water and then like you can actually die from that. And so there is an aspect of that on the personal scale, but also there is this aspect of like you can be at capacity within a physical room in a material sense, but also you can have that problem of like too many cooks in the kitchen type of thing.
So that's interesting because like that's connecting so many things. So I listened to this thing about our ability to increase the accuracy in measurements, right? So like we ended from parts per thousand to parts per million, and now we're like many zeros behind. And the problem with that is like now we're getting awareness, right? So like we're seeing all these poisons, and we're like, oh, like there's cocaine on all dollar bills. Like, oh, like this is there, this is there, this is there, right? And we're gaining this awareness that we're being influenced by these things at like concentrations that we don't know whether they actually matter or not, right? Like in general, like just having short exposure to these things is not going to matter, right? Like maybe prolonged exposure is going to do something, right? But short exposure is not going to matter, right? And also, I've been following this stuff about conversions, right? Like of girls from OnlyFans and how they're received, right? And like one side of the argument is like, well, they're stopping with the perversion, right? They're stopping with that behavior, right? So like they're coming to Christ, like this is a good thing, we should all cheer. And the other side is no, like these are wolves in sheep clothing, right? Like if we just bring them into the fold without vetting them effectively, right? And making sure that they're true, then we're ingesting poison, right? And so like that's kind of like the tug of war that's happening, right? And the third thing is there's a whole debate going in the Netherlands of the crisis of authority that we're having, and like I think it's happening everywhere in the world, right? Which basically means that the head, right, or like Adam here, right, is no longer having control over the feet, right? The people. Like the people are just no longer willing to participate in the nation or whatever, like the institution that they're part of, right? Just because they don't agree with what the head is doing, right? So they're all and so like there needs to be an integration, right? Like the authority of the head cannot only be by force, right? Like they need to carry the body with them, and they need to be integrated, right? But at a certain point, right, like if you just have an individualist at the bottom, right, and like the individualist is going to make an individual determination on every action, whether they agree with it or not, like they can't be part of the body. And like I don't know, maybe I'm preceding, right? Well, that's going to be in the next chapter, right? Like the supporting aspect versus I'll just go there right now. So you have this the supporting aspect versus the covering aspect, right? So if the covering is not happening through proper means, then it can't hold the body. But like, yeah, if the support isn't supportive, then it doesn't matter what's at the head, right? And when these things draw apart too far, right? Like, how are you going to ever resolve this issue, right? Because how are you going to be learning to be a proper head if there's no body that listens to you? But like how are you going to be a proper body if you feel that every head is betraying you, right? Like that, like so we're in this situation where I'm like, yeah, like how do you restore this, right? And then we get, well, like that's kind of also like already the intimacy crisis, right? Because like basically it says that the top and the bottom can't be together, right? They can't be intimate. um but then when we don't have that muscle, right, like we don't have the capacity to know what it's like to be intimate anymore, how are we going to ever get a structure again, right? Or revivify the structures that we have, right? um without the right, like, what is it, spirit, ways of being, right? To live in them. So yeah, that.
Hmm. I'm thinking a bit about. Oh, please go ahead.
Well, I was thinking when I read this and they were talking about what you're integrating via eating or whatever, what I thought of was like, what are you incorporating? Like you're making, like in the sense of not just eating a fruit or something, like, you know, forming a corporation or a company, or like putting something in corporeal form. Like,
Well, and
you
that's
have the fruit there.
revivification, right? Like incorporating something or integrating something is towards the telos of revivification. And if you don't do that, then that's when things become a problem.
So I'm thinking about this aspect of also, so we've got poison at the bottom there, but also there's an upward movement. So like there is this sort of aspect of there's a little bit of kind of a I guess like a connecting point between the stuff that's actually accessible and the other things that are just completely inaccessible or should not be integrated. And I was thinking about this aspect of like you take like dark chocolate. Like dark chocolate contains cadmium, and like cadmium in certain quantities is like lethally bad for you. But also, you can't have dark chocolate without intaking some cadmium. And in fact, having some dark chocolate can also be actually very heart healthy for you, depending on how much of it you're having and how much sugar is in it and all that other stuff. But that's an interesting sort of aspect of like you can actually take in a small amount of something, and the quantity of it can kind of determine whether or not it's poisonous or not. So you take that, or you take like alcohol content of something, or I've been on a tear for like 2 months about accountants and like that type of thing where it's like, you can intake a little bit of cadmium, just a little bit into your company. Maybe, the fact that, all right, maybe there's a little bit of drawback. So the fact that this position exists within the company, but also the benefits outweigh the risks, and with proper orientation and like only very tiny bits of integration of that one sort of thing, that it has its rightful place, and like things don't get disrupted. In fact, they run very, very well, and like that's totally okay. But then also thinking of like once you've already integrated something, there is an aspect of, to the point about revivification, there's some stuff that has already been integrated and that can become stagnant. So there's a necessity to not only incorporate more of it, but also to, like to stir the sauce. Like if you're actively trying to maintain like a pasta sauce or something like that, if you don't stir it, it will start to settle at the bottom and then start to burn and clump up and that sort of thing. So I'm just thinking of there is a little bit of this aspect of you need some light bits of renewal, and I guess that also kind of goes to like the burning off dead wood sort of thing, like just kind of get the other bits exposed to the light a little more. Otherwise, you wind up getting this sort of aspect of the tyrannical from the inside that can come up too.
Yeah, so there, the question is obviously like which externality or which poison at what point, right? Because and how much. So we already went into the Sabbath, right? Like the Sabbath is in some sense the poison to work, right? It's like, or maybe poison is not the right word, but it's the dealing with the poison. Maybe that's a better word, right? It's trying to find a relationship to the poison, or the leftovers, or the remainders, right? Yeah, and so is it on the next page? Yeah, I guess we'll get. Are we okay going to the next page? So yeah, so you have a contamination, right? So it's well, that's when the problems happen, and this is analogous to Peterson's, well, like when you get betrayed or whatever, right? Like how far up did was your mistake, right? Like in other words, right? Like if you get bitten by a snake, right, you have to cut up a limb sometime, right? Like how much do you cut off? It's like that's not an easy question, because if you cut off too little, then like you still get poison. So so yeah, this contaminated limb situation, right? You could see it as a stumbling stone, right? So you can also see it as the well, the snake biting the heel, right? So like if your heel gets bitten, I don't know if it was in in this piece, right? But when when you when you when your heel gets bitten, like you're unable to maintain yourself, right? You you tumble, right? You fall over, right? So you become your own stumbling stone in some sense, right? Like your internal integrity fails you, instead of that, then there's an external imposition that puts you to your knees. Um, uh,
Well,
yeah. So
I want to point out real quick, Manuel, right? So the previous diagram is integration, and this one is intoxication. And so the difference isn't in type, it's in amount. To Castle's point, right? It's not always like, oh, you should never eat cadmium or something, right? Or you should never have alcohol, right? It's how much and how quickly makes the difference in those cases between integration and intoxication. And that's what this is exemplifying here. Is it's right, because down below, right, it's talking about fail to cover, fail to support, right? And so it's not that you can't ingest these things, it's that you have to ingest them in the right amount over the right time. And nobody likes that, because it's two answers and not one, but also it's also really important, right? You have to account for more than one variable at a time to manifest the good in the world. And that can be hard. That's why you need to try not to solve the problems of the world and wars in countries you're not in, and alleged changes in climate and all this other nonsense, because there's a lot to keep track of, just to keep yourself out of what he's calling here internal sin.
It calls to mind for me, and combining that with also the aspect of like the amputation as well. I mean, even just kind of looking at like the dotted lines there, just I'm thinking about that line of like, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off or something. And I talked to some students about this aspect of like, you actually can interpret that literally, because of course there never will have been a time that your right hand was like, it was your right hand's fault that you stole something or that you flipped somebody off or whatever sort of thing. And it's like, so that's, but at the same time, it's an outward sort of material representation of, of course, if your hand actually does go insane, like, yes, but but it's like, if it's this aspect of whatever this is that you have integrated is not hosting you, it's not hosting your spirit correctly, like cut it off. Like that's just, it's not serving the purpose. It's either too much or too little, or it's something completely improper. And it's like that requires like, judgment or diagnosis, to kind of figure that out. But ultimately, it's like if you don't have an answer for it or some sort of antidote, then it's like, yeah, you cut it off. Like that's just, and if you don't respond fast enough, then yes, it does start to spread. So if you don't cut off that little bit, or if you don't cut off enough, maybe you have to cut off a little bit of healthy arm to kind of get ahead of the damage,
Right, and I want to extend this analogy, right, because it's talking about Adam, right, and that he becomes contaminated, right? Like one way to look at the contamination is Eve, right? So he was leaning on Eve, right? And she couldn't hold him, right? Because she provided him with wrong instructions or whatever, right? And so now, right, you get this question, right? Like you don't have like a physical limb, right? But like something in that relationship didn't function properly, right? So it's like, how do you identify that which needs to be cut off, right, or rectified, or whatever means word you want to use? You could also say like there's something broken, right, and so it needs to be set straight again, right? But like, how do you set something? Well, you put external structure on it so that you remove the pressure, right? And like the external structure can hold the bone in place so that you can heal the bone, right? And like healing the bone means also, like, to go back to the second diagrams, like that which covers, right, needs to be reattuned, right, so that it can support that which below it.
Mm. And I think it also goes to the aspect of like one of the additional sort of compounding sins of Adam as well, is that this either not properly maintaining the rules that he heard, because the rules were given to him directly, or failing to communicate them correctly, failing to protect against the consequences of like making an infraction against those. But also, I think something that I remember seeing Matthieu say, and I don't know if it's in this book or not, where he says something like the word, where like the snake goes and says, "Oh, is it true that that God said that you're not allowed to touch?" I think he says like not allowed to touch any of the trees or something like that. And it's like, no, specifically, you're not allowed to eat from this one. But there's an interesting sort of aspect that he detailed at one point where he talks about like the word touch can also mean something like to put a curse on or to strike or something like that. So it's like you could hypothetically, like, there's no rule against putting a sign, like, like a do not enter, like do not eat, assuming you had the materials to do that. Like there's nothing against putting like a signpost or something saying don't cross this line, or something like that, or to put like a curse on it, kind of like the cursed mountain, and be like, okay, like this, do not enter, violators would be prosecuted, that sort of thing, on the tree. So there is a lot more of that, like, well, the limb or like the portion of the body is compromised, but also like, ultimately the problem, especially in the case of the eating, is like as a result of a failure for the head to cover.
Right, but we kind of already went over this pattern, right? Yeah. So we have the teacher that's making a test, right? And then people are trying to metagame the test, right? So the teacher puts up a sign, right? It's like he who's not capable of fulfilling this test may not pass, and then they they always have not accounted for something, right? So there's a problem with putting up the sign, because the sign needs interpretation. It needs a relationship to the sign, and that's like if you wanna take Adam's sin in his leadership, right? He did not account for the complexity of being a steward for Eve, right? Because like Eve didn't directly oppose the instruction, right? But she got swayed into it, right? And you can't preempt that. Like there's no way to preempt the trajectory that someone is going on uh, that will lead them astray, right? Because there's infinite ways to go astray, right? So you can't put up signs at every doorpost or whatever like that's just not going to work, right? So it requires something else, right? Like it requires something in that relationship uh, that is able to fulfill that functionality, but through different means. And like I don't know if it's here, right? But they make a girdle of the leaves, right? And like the girdle is representative of faithfulness and righteousness, right? So if you make your own girdle to cover yourself, it's like you get self-righteousness and believing in yourself, right? Like it's like um so in the center, um the association I made with covering is a tent, because like that's like a different type of covering, right? Like it's covering in the sense of creating a space in which life can happen, right? So it's not a cover like clothing that's like on your body and like basically attached as a second skin, but it's covering as in keeping away, right? Like another way to think about it is like an umbrella, right? Like an umbrella is covering you from the rain, but the means by which it's covering is it's like shielding you from being affected, right? Or you could say, right, like if you go as an ambassador to a different country, right, you carry the name of the country that you're an ambassador for, right? So the things that you get affected with will affect your country. So you're covered in the protection, right, that the country provides for you.
Yeah, I also want to point out that there are a bunch of tent systems and such not that uh, they don't work without the covering. The structure that for the inside of the tent doesn't actually hold up because it pushes against the outside, and so the covering is also the confines of the container. And so when you don't have proper containment, you can't have proper support. Like the two are interrelated. And so if you don't submit to that constraint of the covering, then the support just spreads out and is no longer support, right? It floods. And that's part, it's not the entire relationship, but that's part of the relationship between these covering and support. And that's why things have to meet in the middle, so to speak, although it's far more complicated than that. Like things have to come together in the right orientation and align appropriately so that that third thing can manifest, we'll say, in the middle, right? But that's more like proper bringing down of heaven and bringing up of earth at the same time as a process of refinement over time. And it's a lot to track, but also that, yes, it's a lot to track. And again, if we're busy distracting ourselves, we won't properly track it. But we need to think about that. A cover isn't something that merely keeps the rain away. It also helps to hold the spines of the umbrella together. If you've ever had a torn cover on an umbrella, the umbrella doesn't work to open and close correctly anymore because the cover keeps the spines aligned, right? So both systems fail when one system fails because they are connected in that way. Another thing to think about is the trade-off, right? You want the cover, but you've got a constraint. Like you can't go outside of the confines of the umbrella and then get upset when you get rained on, right? Like an umbrella is a constraint. The fact that you carry it with you just means the constraint isn't the nature that you think it is, but also it still is a constraint. And yes, right? The question is whether or not you want the trade-off. You don't want the trade-off, that's fine. Also, you're going to live in a flood forever, but like no one can stop you, unfortunately. Would that they could, but that you have to appreciate all of the advantages and not just say, well, I don't want this one advantage because I can get it some other way, because there's no single advantage to the covering.
Right, and there's an inheritance. So to go back to this idea of making the girdle of the fig leaves, right? So that's also like becoming like a tree yourself, right? So you're the pillar, right? and you're providing shade, right? Like you create a space under you in which things can adhere to your will. And so there's if you're in that space, like there's an inheritance, right? So there's an inheritance from the top. The space allows you for certain participation, right? And you can imagine that, and like I'm thinking of like the veins of a leaf, right? There's the more intimate you become with that which covers you, the more structural integrity you create, right? And so we can go back to Daniel's point about sin against your what was the thing? Your convictions, right? So what are the convictions, right? Like that's the things that make up who you are, right? Or that's the pillars that support you, right? Like so if you move that up a level to the family, right? Like the things that make you a family, right? Like the inheritance that you've gotten from your past, and the living bones, I guess, right? Like the pillars that are actually held up by people. If you betray those, right? Like if you sin against those pillars, you weaken the integrity of that family structure, right? And so like to go back to Mark's point is like, okay, like we could get that one pillar somewhere else, right? Because like there's no reason why we couldn't. But like when you start divesting or serving two masters or being lukewarm, right? You end up destabilizing the family structure. And then at a certain point, right, like these pillars can't hold things anymore, right? Because they're not covering those beneath them, right? And then they're just an empty shell.
So I was thinking about like, first of all, I was thinking about like, okay, I'm not sure I understand what the spiritual meaning of forbidden fruit really is. It's something more like you trust the snake's promise instead of God's promise. And then I was thinking about like Matthieu Pageau's definition or concept of because like we can dispute what's kosher or what's pure or impure. I mean, I watched a reel the other day. I don't know if this is true, but it said in 1970s, 1% of America was obese, and now 40% of America is obese. Obviously, something's wrong. We all know the food pyramid's garbage, right? There are plenty of things that are legal that are obviously bad just because something's legal. There are other things that are illegal that maybe aren't bad. But it's sort of like in a world. I mean, I'm kind of the fact that it isn't common knowledge to pay attention to how you feel when you eat something shows us that where we are as a culture. Like we're in a world where it's a kind of up to you to discern some of these things. And I'm mad as that I spent 10 years refiguring things out that other traditions have already outlined. Like some foods are Tomzik, Registic, Satwik. Just Google that. I'll say no more. There's tons of literature on this. But meanwhile, we have like the medical industry just prescribing things like benzodiazepines that are creating an epidemic probably worse than the opioid crisis. So anyway, I was thinking about the fact of the state that we're in is sort of a microcosm of kind of the spiritual condition that we're in, because then if you think like in terms of what's the spiritual meaning of forbidden fruit, okay, and then you think, okay, well, some things are kosher or impure, and then I think like, okay, well, what does it mean for something to be kosher or impure? So like to a bodybuilder, for example, food is numbers, and so like what appeals to a person who is strict on their diet and maybe is feeling good, what's motivating them is like, I want to perform well, I want to feel good, I want to function well, and that motivate, like if you care about like whether it could be work, maybe you care, people go on keto to optimize their work performance or whatever, right? If you care about something like this spending attention in this realm and saying like, oh, is this food intoxicating me with insulin? Like that's kind of a byproduct of how you're going to build the ability, how you're going to form your discernment towards these things. But anyway, I was just sort of thinking about like, what's the meaning of forbidden fruit? I'm kind of skeptical about the definition here. I don't know. But I was just sort of making the observation that it seems to be a microcosm of like the tools that we have seem to be a microcosm of like where we are as a culture at many different levels.
Yeah, but that's the sorry, Castle, but
You're fine.
Let me just jump in here. I know you'll forgive me, so I'm just going to do it anyway. But yeah, I mean, this is what's important, right? This is what everyone's missing. Yes, it's a microcosm, right? And materialism, as I define it, which by the way is the most useful definition you're going to find, I guarantee it. Working on this for decades, not years, right? Like believing that something like the law, right, or the system or the earthly, anything earthly, or that emerges from earthly efforts, man-made or otherwise, is going to be the thing that drives the change, or is the thing that caused the change to begin with, right? Oh, the availability of food made us fat, right? The availability of easy food made us fat. No, it didn't, right? Because this is the microcosm, right? What made us fat is eating the food that was available when we could have shipped it overseas and made the Europeans fat. It was a much better option. But like, so if you don't understand that the thing emanates down and it's the emanation that's driving everything, and I don't know why people don't understand this. Aristotle talked about this. Why are there four causes? And why do all causes begin with, quote, final cause? Right, because that's how it works, right? And so it's your higher cause, your spiritual aim or orientation, right, that determines whether or not you'll overeat. Like I'm an aesthetic. I've never overeaten in my life. Although, to be fair, when I was before I got sick, I could eat tremendous amounts of food and nothing bad would happen. So I certainly did eat tremendous amounts of food, but I also always fasted. So it's, it was never that. I don't never eat ring dings. And if I can find some, believe me, I'm buying those puppies, and I'm going to splurge for a day or two and sit and do some coding and probably drink some Mountain Dew and everything, because I haven't done that in years, but I think it's time. I can integrate that. I can, but it is that idea that these material things are driving us to sin or to eat too much or use benzos, or I mean, they prescribed me morphine once. Completely terrified. One uncle on one side, the other uncle on the other side. Both morphine guys both died from drug use. I'm terrified, completely terrified. Was not a problem, thankfully. Think I took the pills twice after I got home. Did not want them to give me morphine in the hospital, but like, you got gallstones, you need morphine. Sorry, this is how that works. It's nothing else is going to help. Nothing else is going to fix you, right? But if you can manage it, you can manage it. And having a healthy fear of those things means they pump me up with all the morphine they want, and I'm probably not going to get addicted. Now, I don't want to test that theory. Thank you very much, because why would you? But also, it was kind of tested, and I kind of passed. It's sort of like Galadriel with the ring, right? It's the same. I mean, that pattern's there for a reason, and this is the problem of the age of gnosis, right? Where we think knowledge is propositions and it's the highest value. And then when we want excuses for things or reasons for things, or we want to use just logic, reason, and rationality to figure out the world, we're going to end up in materialism, which is maybe not a staunch belief in John Vervaeke, was it physicalist reductionism or something? But it's a belief that those material things are what's driving you and driving your behavior and driving other material things, which is impossible. Right. Robots aren't going to implement law better than people can. That's never going to happen, because that's material driving material, and material can't drive material. Right. And so we need to understand that relationship. It is a microcosm. The material is in the realm of the microcosm.
Yeah, so I want to slowly land the plane. I want to pull this up a little bit. So Matthieu Pageau talks about the significance of food, right? Like, so food is like a medium by which things from heaven get captured, and by which things get returned to heaven in glory, right? So that's basically what it's talking about, right? So we have bread, which is like a refinement, right? And then we have meat, which is refined true life, right? And like the meat gets offered back up, right? We have this in all the sacrifices where the meat gets burned. Then we have fruits, right? So we have fruits that come from trees, right? Which are like external connections with heaven that we get to partake in. Then you also have the seeds of the field, right? Which are connections from earth, right? Things that arise from earth that we can use to make bread, right? So that, like, that's the refinement through the participation of man, as opposed to refinement through like cow eating seeds, for example, and refining it that way, right? Like, we refine the meat of the cow by cooking it, right? Like, so there's all of these relationalities. You can find them in the book, but that's basically the main communication method, at least the ones that we've engaged with between heaven and
well, but I would just want to emphasize linking eating and food is an error, according to Matthieu. And that's actually in this chapter, right? I mean, he says the concept of eating is meant to be interpreted at many different scales within the scriptural worldview, right? That's why when you eat of the fruit of the knowledge, like, knowledge is a fruit, like, where, right? So he's making that in the Bible, it's making that explicit connection between the ethereal realm or the spiritual realm, right, and the physical realm through the fruit, right? And so the fruit is the symbol of the knowledge that gets eaten or ingested, right? And then that could be TikTok. That's right. It's the same thing. It doesn't have to be an apple. It could be TikTok. It could be a pear. Pears are better than apples anyway. So he doesn't make the link to food, because food is just one example of eating. You eat lots of things all the time at different scales. And so the significance of that is sort of assumed, right? Well, we need to eat. Sure. And we need to eat of knowledge even. Yes, that is true, right? It's just, it's not the primary thing. And that is the more important lesson, right? In the age of gnosis, knowledge is the primary thing. Like everything else is secondary. That's why people try to convince you of things. If you saw the world the way I see the world, which is if you have the knowledge that I had, you'd agree with me. And then we'd all just do the thing and we wouldn't need anybody to help us to govern us, because we'd all just agree. So clearly, and I have a whole video on this in navigating patterns, right? It's the trick of socialism, right? Like clearly, and John Vervaeke uses that trick too. He basically does it by implication. If you saw the world the way I see the world, you'd agree with me, and then there's no need for leaders or leadership or fighting or contests or any of that stuff, right? It's a nice, flat, equal world too. Very, very dangerous stuff. But he doesn't talk about eating in relation to food because it's a given. It's at some point.
Right, and consumption is making part of, right? You draw it into, right? So we've been talking about intoxication and integration, right? Like to consume something is to integrate, or at least try to integrate it. So I want to respond to this. Well, thank you for the feedback. Also, we take questions and all that stuff. We're gonna like draw an end to this. So at the end, we'll take an intention for a reflection. Then we'll spend a minute in silence, and then we'll share our insights. Like during this time, you can like have some final questions that we can answer. If you like, we also invite you to participate in the ritual of integration, because we think that's actually the important aspect. So we're talking about like eating, right? Like you've eaten by watching this, and now what you need to do is you need to digest, right? You need to take the parts that are able to bless you, right? To construct your being in a good manner, right? And you need to place that into yourself, into your life, and obviously we're here to assist in that process. So does anybody have like an intention for the reflection?
I'm just going to probably just contemplate on the aspect of consumption, I think.
Right. So I like that. I'll just expand that to a diet. What makes a good diet? Maybe that's like how are we eating, right? Like are we cherry picking or so?
How about Manuel, just to really exemplify the point of how these book clubs are run? The cycle or the link or the relationship, any way you want to cut it, between the intention, which comes at the beginning of the book club, it's stated intentions, right, and the integration, which comes at the end of the book club, right, which are the bookends for the middle of the book club, which is the exploration, roughly speaking, or the consumption of the material that Mature so kindly went through all the trouble of writing down in a book for us.
Right. So yeah, like that's important, right? So like we kind of also need to draw a line from where we started to the end to see how that changed us, right? So like yeah, maybe that's like okay, like we've consumed this book club now, and like what did that do with us? So there, that's a way to go into the reflection. We look up when we do this. That helps with being receptive to ideas. Okay, so I was kind of thinking about one aspect that we hadn't mentioned. So when we consume food, we taste it. Uh, it does something to us. Not so much the food itself, but like we feel refreshed, right? Like there's a immediate aspect of our interaction with the food. That's a quality that's not in the nourishing aspect of it, but it's in our engagement with it, right? So I like my intention was waking up, right? So it's like what how do you wake up? Well, you derive energy, right? Like you get refreshed, you get revivified, and so there's an aspect in the participation in the being or in the consummation that's um, doing a separate job in some sense than I guess building the body and it's like it's yeah it's strengthening the body as a body or something, right? It's it well maybe that's what the meaning is, right? Like the meaning is why the body is a body in the first place and um and that we kind of should attend to that, right? Because that's bringing life, right? Like that's making the body alive, because we're talking about all these pieces and like basically we're describing this machine, right? That's interfacing but there's also a spirit in that, right? And there's uh and that spirit binds, right? So we were talking about covering, right? It's like why would you want to be covered? Well, because it's bringing something to you, right? Like you get to participate in something that's allowing you to be, like you allowing you to be you. So that's the thing that I found.
So a few things came up for me. So I was thinking about this aspect of the forbidden fruit. So I was thinking about that there's a line in there right before it gets eaten where it says that it was pleasing to the eye and good to eat. And it kind of brought to mind this aspect of like, you had the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it's like, okay, you've got the good and the beautiful right there, at least by appearances, right? And it's like, and good could here mean like just beneficial or something like that. So it's just like, oh yeah, beautiful and good to join to myself, because that's also, you could expand that meaning out to not just like, oh, this cake looks delicious. Of course, it's not going to make me fat, but also if you think about any of these other things, like, wow, this cherry red car that costs $100,000, like that's pleasing to the eye and good to eat. I would love to have that, or some other sort of ridiculous thing that ultimately, it's like, if that's not true that you should be having that, then it's like, if you can't actually lock all those things in there, then there's disastrous consequences even with tiny stuff. And and that's, yeah, there's a lot there. But then also this aspect of trying to integrate, to Mark's point about like the TikTok thing, like you can have, oh yeah, scrolling for hours and hours looking at flashy videos of people dancing and doing all kinds of funny stuff, like that's pleasing to the eye and good to join to myself. Like, yeah, I would have a wonderful time doing that, until you scroll until it's dark.
Yeah, well, it's a local good as opposed
Yeah.
to a global or universal good. Just had that
Yeah.
Twitter argument yesterday and today, right? But then there's also true to what? It's not true to the will of God. How do you know that? Because he told you.
Right.
It's not that like everybody
Yeah.
goes like, there's no reason why you can't eat. And I'm like, bro, like read the text. It's not that.
Yeah.
It's not a hidden reason. You don't need to do a lot of interpretation on those words to figure this out. And so that's the way in which it's not true. And it's not that it's not true to the will of God that you never had it or will have it. It's true to the will of God that you don't try to get it right now. Right. And that this is where a lot of people go wrong, especially we'll say in Protestant circles. Biblical interpretation, it's very flat time mode. And a lot of the Bible is showing you through contradiction, or what looks like contradiction, even though it's not, that what's important are things like time and context, right? And there's a lot of stuff about now's not the time, right? Like there's a lot of stuff like that, and people just kind of skim right over that part, and they go, see, you should never eat a fruit, and therefore we shouldn't have any knowledge. And I mean, you can interpret that 1,000 different poor ways unless you incorporate time and realize you're just not true to the current will of God. And yeah, I mean, the idea that the Old Testament and the New Testament don't belong together or somehow conflict because like the nature of God has changed or something crazy. It's just like, no, there's time and there's development and change. And what you need when you're young, we'll say as a race or a culture or humanity, it changes as you get older. So there's new lessons to be had. And that's why the book changes the lessons. Right? But it's not to contradict itself. It's to give you a sense of time and change, because that's super important.
Yeah. And I'm thinking also there's this aspect of like the exploration too. So when you have the pleasing to the eye and good to eat, you have that sort of aspect of like, you have, when you kind of mentioned, you've got the intention, the exploration, and then the integration. And it's like the thing that's missing is the integration. Like there's exploration going on there, and like there's an intention. It's a low intention, but like those two elements are there, and so you're still you're missing out on that aspect. And I was thinking about also the like on the communal scale, another like set of examples that are explicitly told to like the Israelites of you shouldn't integrate these people is they talk about like sorcerers and enchanters and that sort of thing. And like in Greek, like that is like pharmakeia, which is like the root of pharmacy and stuff. So you've got preparer of drugs, poisoner, a sorcerer, or an enchanter. So there is that sort of aspect of, okay, it's not always the case that when someone does a certain thing, like presents something that would normally be poisonous, say like the bronze serpent on the stake or something like that itself is not necessarily that bad thing, but there is a set time and place for that. And you're not like integrating guys who's like make their living doing that type of thing. So there is sort of consequence of that. And I like what Manuel brought up about the taste aspect. So it brought to mind, and this is something, I've been doing my left-handed mediation here, just kind of in the exploratory mode. And I was thinking about this thing of, that the left hand a lot of times is like for feeling stuff. It's not really like an accurate sort of way of integrating stuff. But it reminded me of, there's like a brutal line that King Solomon writes, where he says like a beautiful woman without, it's usually translated to discretion. He says it's like a pig with a gold ring in its nose, or like something brutal, absolutely brutal. But Matthieu says that the original Hebrew word actually translates to taste. So like the ability to just like check on this thing and see like, okay, let me just check a little bit of this thing and see like, is that good or is it no good? And then like being willing to like discriminate or start to integrate or something like that. And of course the implication there is also not like, oh, he's finger wagging at women that aren't doing this, but also kind of by negative contrast, praising someone who is like, oh my goodness, someone who actually checks first and actually like does a little bit of light exploration without completely diving into the pool first, without knowing that it's not, like completely rancid or something like that. So that's sort of my conclusions of my left-handed mediation today.
Now, I want to add a little bit on the taste. So when I started studying chemistry, I had a old guy, and he's like, in the old day, we just tasted stuff to know if it was in there. Like this tasting was just a participatory element, and now it's like, well, you can't do that. Like, and like bad stuff happened, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how I think ecstasy got invented, because some guy just tasted this stuff.
I have a story about that actually. I volunteered at this big aquarium the one time, and there was a report of an ozone leak because like there's an enormous pipe system, and like they have this giant pipe facilities with all these different chemicals and stuff to keep these massive aquariums up and running. And so there's like this foam that is like accumulated on the ground underneath the pipe. And it's not clear that it actually came from the pipe, but like they evacuate the entire building. And they have a technician come out, and they're going and they're watching the guy at the distance, and he bends down and looks at the thing, sticks his finger in it, and sticks it in his mouth. He's like, no, that was whipped cream. And just, it's like, if he was wrong, he would have died right there.
Yeah, my friend's father worked at, I think it was Merck, and he worked with a guy who was, 7 million years old or whatever, and had been working there this whole time. And they used to make this one chemical. I don't think you ever told me what the name of it was, but they used to make this one chemical over there. And the way he knew it was ready, for production to be shipped out and all that, was he tasted it. And when he died, they had to stop making the chemical because they never figured out a way to measure whatever it was he was tasting.
Wow.
And so that sort of thing still happens. Like, we all think it's all science and measurement, and that's just a lie. It's just a flat out lie. It is for some things, maybe, but it's not for a whole bunch of really important things.
Right, and that also goes to attunement, right? And it's like the quality of alignment, all of these things, right? Like this connects to staying true, because we don't have the answers, right? We have to do it with well, like our senses. like, does it make sense? Well, everybody, thanks for watching.
Yeah, I guess. Well, let me
Please.
just chip in real quick. I think like something I've noticed throughout pretty much my entire life is, I mean, I like to think that I'm the kind of person who pays a lot close attention to my mental, physical, and emotional diet, so to speak. But like almost throughout my entire life, there have been just tons of periods and things that have gone badly and well, and I almost never understand completely why. Like, I've just noticed that I've never been the one to get much value out of self-reflection, but there are lots of forces that are bigger and stronger than you that are seemingly beyond understanding. I mean, you could live with the mind, you could list many of them that are fairly obvious, like spending time around people, community, traveling, you draw inspiration from people and events that occur, or having your hand forced by tragedy. But like with the mind, I can list all these factors about, mental, emotional, physical states, but like I've noticed throughout my life, suddenly, like it's like literally grace from God. Like, things change all the time, and I've almost never been able to explain them. Like, I can give some examples. Like, I had two high school friends. I wasn't super close to them, but within the last couple of months, I had two high school friends that committed suicide. Which I wasn't super close to them, so it didn't like wreck me emotionally or anything. But it's an obvious opportunity for some reflection. Like, one of them, his name was Jason. He lived one street over from me. He was married 6 years and had 2 kids. We rode the same bus to school and everything, you know. But like I've noticed that, like, I don't know. I guess I've always noticed, like, so I mean, that would just be an example of like, oh, I noticed that here's an event occurred. I performed this reflective process, and you would think that, like, oh, maybe this would produce an emotional or perspectival change, etc. But like, there have always been periods in my life where I'm trying to do things for like months with like insane friction, and then suddenly things like change and I have no idea why. So like lately, like, I've been having like this effortless time doing all kinds of things that I've been trying to do for months, and I can't explain why, So that's just an observation, that I've made just from for whatever it's worth.
Well, and that's the right. There's no such thing as self-transcendence that cannot ever be made any sense of. It's contradiction in terms, for real. Like, don't buy into it, right? Like, you're affected by and connected to everything around you, and you can't even know what that is, right? And so everybody makes fun of the unknown unknowns, but also that's where all the magic and wonder and potential is, and possibility and all that stuff. So we can't get too caught up in those things. Also, self-reflection is actually not supposed to work in the moment. This is one thing that people who haven't been exposed to a rich, long-lasting, unchanging, or relatively unchanging tradition don't understand, right? Is that when you engage with a tradition that's long-lasting and mostly unchanged, you start to figure out, oh, it's not every time I do this something happens. It's doing this makes a bunch of things more likely to happen, and they happen over time, and not on my time schedule, because there's a lot more that goes into it. But when you open up the space through the ritual, especially a ritual that works, right? You can't just gin up a ritual in a day, or one that's lasted a week or a few months or 25 years. Like that's not going to work for the long term. But when you're involved in one of these rituals that we'll say has been curated and shaped through time by a distributed cognition of maybe millions of people, who knows, over hundreds or thousands of years, that gives you better odds at when you self-reflect or contemplate or ruminate, a better word that Matthieu uses, that things, maybe not in the moment, but things will eventually come to you. And that's more it, right? Because what you're doing with ritual and sacred spaces, we'll say everybody else's crazy conversations about such things aside, is you're opening up a space in yourself, right, for external things to change you. In other words, engagement with ritual, especially an older ritual, one that's been around a lot longer than we'll say your parents and grandparents have, that is making this making the space in yourself, right, by submitting to ritual for humility. And humility is the thing that allows you to change. And you know what else allows you to change? Nothing.
I think
And
also participating in I think also participating in a ritual like that's something that you're like consuming and using to like revivify yourself. And that's how the space changes within you or whatever. So
okay, I kind of lost my point. Yeah, so no, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. We're doing this weekly, so please join again next week. Also, comments and questions are really appreciated. Oh yeah, I know, I remember. It's like the forbidden fruit is trying to have the change when you're not ready to have the change. There we go. Like that. And yeah, see you next week.